as it, as long as you accept that the Torah is the authentic word of God, then what you should be able to do is, once you put the Bible on a sacred pedestal, you will have the license to be able to interpret it in an authentic manner, as long as it's consistent with the basic rules. And she says, otherwise the Bible becomes babble. And it's not just a classic book of Jewish culture, but it's actually the word of God. And in fact, to meet the challenge, because that's what usually happens. When you're challenged, when we're pressured, we're able to, if we are able to respond, so then the entire matter becomes even greater. It grows, it develops in the most positive manner. And that's exactly what took place, because if you read the commentary of Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, okay, it's a 19th century German interpretation based upon certain beliefs that he had, based upon society in the mid-19th century, which was a society that was developing, and they all believed was going to be a utopian society. Rabbi Hirsch could not envision what would be taking place in the 1920s, the 1930s, and the 40s. But the point is, his commentary was actually initiated to combat that which was a negative approach. You have Rabbi David Tzvi Hoffman, the very, very great scholar, who also wrote a great work. And in Eastern Europe, you had Rabbi Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg, the Ktav HaKabbalah, also using philology, using more modern methodologies in interpreting the Bible. Even the Malbim, the famous Malbim and the Tziv, all used those kinds of approaches. So it's something which is, I think, something that we should encourage, something that we should laud, something that I believe is a positive development in the study and Bible studies. And that's my point. I want to say another thing, if I can. The beginning of the book of Bereshit, which deals with creation and the origin of civilization, the origin of man, is something that's very, very vexing. Now, it didn't used to be vexing, because up until the 20th century, almost everybody believed in a form of the divine, and certainly there was never a question about how the world came into being. Aside from Aristotle, who believed in the co-eternity of God and the universe, most people had no problem with creation. Christians, Muslims, Jews, all shared that belief that there's a God and God created the world. That was the belief in creation. Okay. However, beginning with the 20th century, certainly the second half of the 20th century, we began to have scientific inquiry. And in the 20th century, there was an explosion of scientific knowledge, and much of it in terms of the origin of the heavenly bodies. And then in 1965, they discovered the remnants of that initial ball of light, that incredible explosion that took place eons ago, billions of years ago. And the origin of the heavenly bodies was no longer attributable to God, no longer was a mystery. And that initial ball of light that they discovered, and the Hubble expansion of the galaxies, and the Kobe space satellite in 1990 that showed the black body spectrum of the microwave background and radiation, all of this is an echo of the Big Bang. We can now listen to the Big Bang. So it was a challenge, a tremendous challenge to Jews and Christians who had faith in creation. And this is something that many of our children, when they're in schools, are faced with. When they're studying science on the one hand, and in the morning they're teaching them all of the Bible studies and the Jewish studies, and in the afternoon, so there seems to be a conflict. And it's something that we need to address. It's something that perhaps has not been addressed as well by us as believing Jews in a manner that we could have explained it. Now, the truth is, at this point, there are many books written by physicists who believe in creation. And they also believe in the Big Bang to explain how there's no contradiction between the Bible story. Now, the Bible story of creation, what's interesting is that the Rambam Maimonides, he says, you can't take that literally. You can't read that book. We're not creationists. Rambam says you can't read the account in the Torah and know how God created the world. Even the Ramban, a great Kabbalist, he says, no, you can't. The creation story are great secrets, tremendous secrets that need to be uncovered only by the deepest and most profound thinkers. And in fact, one of the people who writes books is a great physicist, and he's in the physics department in Bar-Ilan University, wrote a number of books about making the Big Bang compatible. Just one of the things that he says, which I think is something which is rather remarkable, because what did God create on the first day? God created light. Now, where does light come from? It comes from the sun, the moon, the stars. There were no sun, moon, stars on the first day. That wasn't until the fourth day, till Wednesday. So what was the light? What was the light before God created the heavens, the heavenly bodies? And that's a question. But if you understand, Vayomer Elokim Yehi Or, and that's the primeval light, that's that light ball. That's incredible, and it's the sudden appearance of the ball of light. You know, Stephen Hawking, who was a noted physicist, they say one of the greatest minds of the 20th century. Stephen Hawking University. He himself, and he was a noted atheist, he himself said, and I'm quoting, the creation lies outside the scope of the presently known laws of physics. Or Joseph Silk of University of California, who writes about the Big Bang. He says, you know, the Big Bang is the modern version of creation. And so Natan Aviezer in his book, he actually says that's a great explanation. And he goes on to explain how many of the other things are also in consonance with a reinterpretation of the Mikra, the reinterpretation of the creation story. I don't know if you remember this, but when Rabbi Sachs, of blessed memory, what a loss to the Jewish people, Rabbi Shammas Sachs's death. But if you remember, a number of years ago, he really fell out of favor with a whole group of people when he spoke about the story of Adam and Eve as an allegory, that it wasn't to be taken literally. And he really took it on the head. Now, between me and you, Rabbi Sachs is a great scholar. Whatever he said was well documented. He has sources for everything that he said. But in fact, the story of Adam and Eve as an allegory is something that Rabbi Sadia Gaon says. It's not something which is so outrageous, because many of the rabbis, Rabbi Sadia Gaon, we're talking here now about the 900s, the 1000s, he himself says all of the stories in the Bible have to be understood on many different levels. And the same thing can be said, says Natan Aviezer, about even the story of the origin of man. Because if you look at the Bible story, and then everybody's acquainted with Rabbi Soloveitchik's solution of the problem, but there were other solutions to the problem. Rabbi Soloveitchik was not confronted with Cro-Magnon man and Java man and Peking man. And he was not confronted by many of these problems. So he has Adam the first and Adam the second, the two typologies of the human being. But in fact, that's a very big problem in the creation story, that there are two creations of man. Why did God create man twice when there's only one man and one woman? And Natan Aviezer goes to say that there were different recensions of man, and this is not a great secret. The Kabbalists of the 11th and 12th centuries already told us that the world is a lot older even then than 5,782 years. So that the 5,782 is a date that starts at a particular point in time, just as the rabbis tell us, Vahi Erev Vahi Voker, and even the rabbis of the Medrash say it in the Midrash HaGadol. It says, Vahi Erev Vahi Voker, Malamed Shebara HaKadosh Baruch Hu Olamot. God created many worlds, below Hayu Na'ela, and God didn't like them. The Hechrivan, and God destroyed them and created new worlds. So this he uses in order to explain many of what would seem to be the contradictions between science and religion. You know, I had a teacher, I had a Rebbe, Rabbi Yitzchak Hutner, who used to always say, there can't be a contradiction between science and the Torah, because God created the laws of nature. So there seems to be a contradiction. Either you don't know the Torah properly, or you don't know the science properly. But if you know both of them properly, there couldn't be a contradiction.
I have to ask you a question.
Something that we should concentrate on when we study the book of Bereshit, certainly Parshat Bereshit, that is something that we should certainly concentrate on. I want to speak about another thing, if I can, which I think is pretty important in terms of how to read the book of Bereshit. Rashi, just in the very beginning of his commentary, asks the question, why do we have the book of Bereshit altogether? The Torah is supposed to be about Jewish law. He says the Torah shouldn't have Bible stories. It should begin from HaChodesh Hazel Lachem. Once the Jews are leaving Egypt, all of the stories that came before, what do you need them for? And Rashi gives his answer. But in fact, there are many, many commentaries, very older commentaries, who tell us that the reason for these stories, and we know this, just a phrase we know from the Ramban, from Nachmanides, 13th century rabbi, who says, look at the book of Bereshit, look at these Bible stories, and Maaseh Avot Siman Labanim, that what took place, the stories that we read about in the Bible, in the Torah, in Bereshit, they all have reverberations and echoes in the future. So that in the future there'll be an echo of what came in the beginning, and that all of Jewish history is just really a redux of what was taking place in the stories in the Bible. I just want to just show one of them, if I can. I think I have a few minutes left, just to show one of them of how this works. So let's talk about some of the major issues that you have in the book of Bereshit as they pertain to Jews. So we have two twin brothers who are born to Yitzchak and Rivka, and the Yaakov and Esau. They're twin brothers, but they're diametrically opposed to each other. They are not the same. They're the opposites. One of them is materialistic. He was Ish Tzayid, and the other person is very spiritual. He's a Yoshev Ohalim. One of them is good. Yaakov Ish Tam, he's wholesome and he's good. And the other one is a very, very evil person. He is Tzayid B'fiv. He's a person filled with guile and filled with deception. He is the embodiment of evil. And the struggle between good and evil continues until today, until this very, very day. I don't know how many people were killed today by terrorists, but I'm sure people someplace on the globe were killed by terrorists. That's evil. That's personification of evil, but evil exists and good exists. Tremendous amount of good, tremendous amount of evil still exists, and the struggle will continue till the end of time. But from the Torah, we know that good and evil have earlier roots, and it starts from the very beginning. Because what do we read about that tree of knowledge? God even tells them, don't eat from that tree, which is a combination of good and evil. Because on the day that you eat from them, you're going to unleash good and evil. Evil will be unleashed. And God says, please don't eat from the tree. Now, they do eat from the tree. And the consequences are terrible, terrible consequences. Now, superficially, if you think about the story of Adam and Eve, there's no connection between the story of Adam and Eve and Esau and Yaakov. But if you think about it more deeply, look at the story of Adam and Eve. So the serpent, this creature, whatever it was, which is in itself an issue, a problem to define. So this Nachash is Arun. It's sly, diabolical, more so than any other, mikol chayat hasadeh, for any other living thing. So what does the Nachash do? He whispers in Eve's ear and said, eat. She says, no, God said, don't eat. And he said, no, he's only trying to fool you. And he tricks Chava to violate God's will. And then what happens is Adam and Chava, who were once innocent, they were once very, very wholesome, they now know that they're naked. They're hiding from God. They now have unleashed evil in the world. And they understand it and they know it. And they're embarrassed. Before that, Veloyit Bashashu, they were not embarrassed. But now they're embarrassed. They're hiding from God. And God has to curse them. Because God said that now you unleashed evil. And the curse, we still are feeling the curse. God tells man, it's not going to be easy to make a living. And he tells Chava, you're going to bear children, but the matter of having children is not going to be without pain, not going to be without difficulty. And many, many generations later, almost 2,000 years later, there's a woman who's pregnant and having a difficult time. Her name is Rivka. And she says, Lama ze anochi, she's in terrible pain. And she goes to OBGYN, he doesn't have an answer. She has to go to a prophet to find out what's going on because it's so unusual. She's the only matriarch to complain. None of the other matriarchs, they had difficulty in having children, but none of the other matriarchs complained when they were pregnant. They wanted to have children. She's the only one. She's a dim echo of Chava, of whom it was said, Be'etzev Teldi Banim, because Rivka, if you analyze it properly, is like Eve. She's like Chava. Because Chava, by eating from the fruit that God said don't eat from, she unleashes on the world good and evil. And what comes out of the womb of Rivka is the embodiment of good and the embodiment of evil, Esav and Yaakov. And Esav and Yaakov are opposites. One is good and one is not. One is evil and one is good. The interesting thing is that their father, Yitzchak, does not see the difference between Esav and Yaakov. He cannot see the difference. He cannot see the distinction between good and evil. To him, everything is good. Yitzchak perhaps doesn't know what good and evil is. He's like Adam and Chava were before they sinned. His Akedah, the fact that he was offered up as a sacrifice to God, perhaps it transformed him into this innocent living being who's living in Gan Eden, even if he's not in paradise. But the point is his innocence, like in the case of Adam and Chava, their innocence and their wholesomeness can be catastrophic. Because if Yaakov was not going to get the blessing, and if Yitzchak's plan to give the blessing to Esau would be successful, there probably would be no Jewish people, because the blessing would be going to Esau. And God's plan for the world, because God had a plan for the world that he had to enact through Avraham, because the first two attempts didn't work. He had to destroy the world in the Dor HaFlaga. They were of no use to God. So then God's plan would have been thwarted. It would have been stymied, just as it was by the Dor HaMabul and the Dor HaFlaga. It can only be restored by the same means it was first introduced into the world by, the Nachash, which is to use guile and deception. Because when the Nachash used guile and deception, the result was good and evil were unleashed. So Rivka had to use guile and deception to correct and overcome the evil. And the blessing must go to Yaakov. So the guile of the Nachash, which is taking place now in its echo form, is now being redeemed. Rivka was using guile for good. And food is also a reverberation and an echo. In the first sin, they were dealing with forbidden fruits. And in the case of Yaakov and Esav, it's an Azir Adashim. It's a pot of beans. And in terms of the blessing of Yaakov, it's venison. So again, there's food. And again, you find it with the sin of Adam and Chava, they're naked. So God makes them katnot or vayal b'shem. God makes them animal skins for clothes. And Adam and Eve are wearing animal skins. And Rivka also uses animal skin to put on the arms of her son Yaakov, using exactly the same thing in the opposite way. And later on, Yehuda will take goat skin and dip it in blood to precipitate another evil, the evil of the selling of Yosef. So that the entire book of Bereshit, if we analyze it in this manner, has echoes with the actions and the events that engender other actions and events. Nothing goes unanswered. That's one of the great points of the book of Bereshit. Nothing that a person does goes unanswered. V'hakol b'sefer nichtavin, as we read in Pirkei Avot, because the future is always the continuation of the past. How you choose to live today always influences your tomorrow. And that's really one of the great lessons of Bereshit that we see. And that's one of the great reasons why these Bible stories should be reread again and again and reanalyzed again and again by whatever means that is available and that is possible. So those are my musings, M-U-S-I-N-Gs, of the book of Bereshit, at least for this evening. And I thank you very, very much for the opportunity to share these ideas with you. And again, it's a very great honor to be able to, in any way, speak to the Elizabeth of Scarsdale. And again, I thank Mr. Smith for inviting me. And I thank, of course, Rabbi Morgenstern always for his graciousness and his goodness.
Before you leave, Rabbi Fink,
Yes.
and thank you so much. It was very insightful. Does anybody have any questions? You could put it in the chat or you could unmute yourself and ask.
Shkoyach, Rabbi Fink. I apologize that my my camera doesn't work for some reason. But Yeshkoyach, and thank you, Rabbi Fink.
I know what you look like. Quite welcome. Okay, great.
Are there any questions?
Nora Wallach had put a question into the chat that asks, I thought there were two creations of woman, not man.
Well, there are two episodes of the creation of humans.
Yeah, it's a humanity issue. It's not about woman or man, it's humanity.
We no longer are involved in gender and gender identity. We are universal.
Okay.
But I think what we're talking are the two creation. There are two creation stories of humanity.
Okay.
That's a great note to end on. And echoing Rabbi Morgenstern, I say thank you on behalf of Young Israel of Scarsdale and everyone from your shul who's listening as well.
My pleasure.
I look forward to more dialogues like this.
Okay, anytime.
Thank you.
Be well. Have a good
Night,
Take care, neighbor.
Okay, be well.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.